So part 2, in this video, we're going to go over editing, specifically color correcting and color grading. Now, some of you may have heard those terms, and sometimes they're used kind of intertwined together, but they definitely mean something different. Color correcting is going through every individual clip that you have and correcting the way it looks, adjusting the initial color of how you want that to look. Then once you've gone through every clip, color grading is typically adding something that's called a LUT on top of the footage to give it one final kind of like overview color that kind of ties everything together. So first off is always color correcting. So to color correct, so when you select the clip you want to edit in Adobe Premiere, up here in the top you have all of these menus. Now you can set these up and customize them yourself if you want to, move certain windows, size them the way you want, move stuff around, make this bigger, make it smaller, whatever. You can save your custom workspace, or you can do something like this and go and click on color if you want to edit the color and the look of your footage. Now, when you're editing in Adobe Premiere, you will be editing through Lumetri Color. Now, when you click on Lumetri, you have these options like here, such as Basic Correction, Creative, Curves, Color Wheels and Match, HSL Secondary, and Vignette. The ones, if you are new to Premiere, the ones you're probably going to want to stay in are going to be Curves, Creative, and Basic Correction. Now, while editing color on some footage, there are two types of editing. There are chrominance and luminance. Now, normally chrominance is what you want to start with first. Now, chrominance are things such as the curves. It is the data and the information of the color that is already inside your footage. Luminance are things like changing color to this video itself and adding light or luminance that is not already there. And so typically that's why you would like to start with chrominance, which is stuff, the information that is already in the clip that you shot. So this isn't a set rule, but I always like to start with curves. You are more than happy to start with basic and adjust your exposure the way you need to and go into highlights and things like that. However, I like to start in curves. While you're in curves, this is just the simple curves format like Photoshop and Adobe Lightroom, where your left side here you have your shadows, and on the right side here you have your highlights. And so I always like to kind of drop my shadows a little bit and then raise my highlights. And you can see I have a very nice S-curve going on here, and if you uncheck these boxes you can see what you've done. You can see already this has already brought this clip to life a lot more by really bringing in those blacks and shadows and showing the contrast between the waterfall and the background. So once you've done that, then you can go into things like basic. You can maybe cool the clip down a little bit, you can warm it up with your temperature. You can change your exposure if you need to, but I really like the exposure where it's at. You can add contrast in there. Contrast is different in video than Lightroom and Photoshop. I would definitely not go up to like 60 or 70 or 80. It may look okay in here, but once you export it's gonna look awful. I'd probably stay under the 20s maybe with the contrast. You wanna go too high. You can adjust your shadows the way you need them, your blacks and things like that. So I really just think the way I use the curves and then the temperature, I'm really liking how this clip looks. As for sharpening, there are multiple ways to sharpen your footage. Instead of going very complicated and in depth, we're just going to do a very easy way. You can go to the creative here. In the creative tab, you have this sharpen button, or this lever right here. Sharpening is also another thing that is very different compared to Photoshop and Lightroom. A nature scene like this, if this was a still image in Lightroom, I could easily put this up to 80 points and it would look good. You do not want to do that much in video. I would probably say 20, 25 max maybe. So you just, maybe add in 20 there. And that's really all you're going to want to do if you want to just add some sharpening, just make your video look a little bit more crisp and good. So there's tons of options to play around in here. You can, your color wheels, you can add different stuff here in your shadows as well, and your highlights. You can actually move these around to put color into it, and get really funky with some things. But I'm gonna keep it there. And again, if you're wondering what you changed, just always kind of uncheck it and go, okay, slight subtle changes are the things that go the longest distance. You want to make huge drastic changes. And if any of these levers you don't really understand what they are, biggest rule of thumb is always just drag it all the way to the left, drag it all the way to the right, and you're going to very easily go, okay, that does that. And you can do this, with everything in here. Just pretty much drag stuff one way, drag it the other way, and you can figure out what it's going to do, and then there you can make changes on how you want your footage to look. So that is the basic coloring and editing of something. So say you got this clip to look exactly the way you want it, and say you have similar clips along the way that you want to have a similar feel. Instead of having to go to the next clip and then sit here and go through every single one of these things over and over again, once you like the way something looks, you can hit Command C and copy the footage. You make sure it's selected first, don't have it unselected. Select it, Command C for copy, or just go over here to copy, and then go to the new clip you want to do something to. And if you right click the new clip you want, this paste attributes will be here. And when you click that, it's asking you want all these things on here. The answer is yes. You click OK. And then you can see how this changed dramatically. So if we go back over here to curves, you can see how that's already been changed because it applied what I did to this clip over to this clip. So now granted, everything's not going to be 100% perfect. I could come over to this one. Let's see, paste attributes. Okay. Maybe that's too dark, right? And so I go in here, and maybe I go to my curves and say I brought my shadows down too much. Pull them up a little bit and say, I like how that looks. So the nice part about that is you can sit here and select multiple clips, right click them, and then do paste attributes, and then you just have to go into every individual clip and maybe just tweak a couple things and just do some fine tuning. So if you have a really long timeline with tons and tons of clips out here, copying and then right click paste attributes is going to save you a lot of time. Okay, so say you've colored everything the way you like, you've gone through and you've corrected your footage. Remember, color correcting, color grading. You've corrected it first by going in here and individually changing, highlights, shadows, your curves, things like that, the temperature of the clip. And you've applied all of that across the board, and every single clip has been colored the way you want. Other things you can do while editing is if you go back over to the editing tab up top, you have sometimes it might be on source. If you click effects control, what the effects does is the clip you have selected, you have options to change the position, move it up, move it down, move it left, move it right. You can scale things, you can, bring your clip in really close, you can pull it away. You have that to do a lot of things. Another thing when you are done editing is using adjustment layers. Adjustment layers are very helpful for many things. So if you go down here to your project bin area, this one right here says new item. Click on that and you can click adjustment layer. Now adjustment layer again is automatically going to recognize what your sequence settings are at. So this recognizes this is 1920 by 1080 because this is 1080 footage. This is what we're setting at. So that's what I want. I will click OK. And if you see over here now, it has been added on the left side. So you can take this adjustment layer, pull it over here, and just like any other clip, you can sit here and, cut things the way you want it and move it, or you can shrink it down, or you can pull it across to fit everything you want. So adjustment layers are helpful for a number of things. Say you can put it above just this clip and you can add effects to the adjustment layer. You can put things into it to do certain types of transitions, make footage move, make footage spin, do weird things with color. Adjustment layers are very helpful with that. Another thing you can use adjustment layers for is for color grading. Remember we talked about, we did our correcting, now we're gonna color grade. Say I like the overall footage of how this looks, and say I want to add a LUT to my footage, and I want everything to be unified and look the same. So I can drag this adjustment layer to the end of my timeline. And by the way, another thing to keep in mind is adjustment layers always need to be the most top thing. If I have this adjustment layer here and then this video clip right here, whatever I apply to this adjustment layer will not affect this clip because it's the clip is above it. So always make sure that your adjustment layer is above because it only affects what is below it. So we'll go back over to color. I want to add a LUT to all this footage. So back in Lumetri Color when we were editing, go back over to basic correction and you can see right there it says input LUT. So make sure your adjustment layer is selected. You can go to input LUT and you already have some default ones here, or if you have some that you've downloaded from the internet for free or some that you've made yourself, you can go to browse and wherever they are saved at, you can select the LUT you want, click open. So now, the first thing to keep in mind is with adjustment layers and stuff, don't think right away like, oh my gosh, this looks awful, because I mean, yes it does. But when you go back over to editing, when you're selected on the adjustment layer, you just applied something to this. You applied a LUT or an effect, right? So this is where effect controls comes in. You go over to effect controls with the adjustment layer you want, and the opacity level is what affects this. So right now it's at 100%, which obviously is way too much. So you can drag this down and go to 0 and this looks normal again. And you can start moving your mouse up and start slowly adding this until you go, right there is good, at like 51%. And so 51% is where I want this to be. And so, you know, obviously that's a little too dark. You can go, because I didn't, actually it doesn't look too bad. So you go around to all the footage, and so basic rule of thumb is, I did this really fast for purposes of this video, but if you've color corrected the video the way you want this to look, once everything more or less looks the same, adding a LUT at the end is like one last unified color. You adjust the opacity the way you want, and it gives it kind of a unified look. But again, color grading at the end here using a LUT, that's a little bit more advanced. If you just want to color correct stuff by just going in and individually changing your exposure, your contrast, your color, whatever, that's totally fine. You do not have to use a LUT by any means. Another thing adjustment layers are helpful for is, say you want those cinematic black bars across your video. How do you do that? Again, you'll use adjustment layer. Now you want this to be the uppermost thing, because you obviously want this to be applied across all of the video. So again, you'll drag over another adjustment layer. You'll make it the whole length of the video. Now, over in your effects tab, and if not, you can maybe go to window effects if you are missing that. Go to your effects tab, and in here you can type crop. Now this crop right here, you're going to drag over and place onto this adjustment layer. Now again, we are going to go over to effect controls, and this adjustment layer was called crop. You can see it's been added right here, it's labeled crop. And so you have the top and bottom is what we're going to want to work with. The top you can move with your mouse, and probably be somewhere between 12 and 5 maybe. I always like my footage to look really widescreen, so I do 10. That's just my footage. You can add anything you want, and you're going to want to do the same thing to the bottom. And so right there you have those cinematic Hollywood black lines across your footage. Again, this is something you don't need. This is just something extra you want to add on, and these are what adjustment layers are used for. So you can literally have 200 adjustment layers in here. You can have like your crop bars, you can have your LUT, which changes the color and the look of your footage. You can have individual adjustment layers over each clip that are maybe applying certain effects to it, like maybe lens flares or transitions or things like that to the individual clip. So adjustment layers are very powerful. And anytime you use them, you can go over here to effects, and you have all sorts of options, audio effects, audio transitions, video effects. You can go inside all of these things and look for options of stuff. Sorry, I have it typed in. You can look for options of stuff that you want to apply to these adjustment layers, and then you just go select it, and you can change things individually here, or your opacity as well. One last thing to go over with editing is maybe if you want a fade in or fade out on your footage. Another a way to do that, this doesn't have to be applied by the adjustment layer, this can be the clip itself. Over in your effects tab, and again, if you can't find that, go over to Window, Effects, and you can pull it up. Go over to your effects, and in the search bar, type dip to black. I mean, again, like a lot of programs, there's multiple ways to do this. You can use keyframes, and with your opacity, you can set it at 100. And at the end where you want it to fade out, you can set it to 0. So over a time period, it'll fade away to 0. Or you can do something like this. You select this dip to black, and you throw it on the clip you want. And then individually with this little guy, you can see the duration is shown on the bottom right there. It's a minute, or it's 1 second and 20 frames. It's 2 seconds and 10 frames. You can adjust it how you want. Say I want this to be 1 second. And so when you get to the end of this footage, it fades away to black. You can do the same thing where you can grab that dip to black. You can add it on the front of your clip, and that way it's going to fade in. So many ways to use stuff like that. Play around with the effects, type stuff in, drag things over, change opacities, change the length of them, play around with it. And again, once you're done with everything, you go to File, Export your footage. And if you need to remember how to do that, watch the first video and you can know how to set your settings appropriately to export the video the way you want.